Our keynote speaker, Professor Mieczyslaw Biskupski, who works at the University of Connecticut, comes up and is our keynote speaker this morning. This afternoon. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I should like, first of all, to congratulate the organizers of the conference for this fine idea. And secondly, I should like to express my profound honor at being allowed to be the keynote speaker. I hope I don't fail you. I have bad news, however, and that is I plan to speak for over 5.5 hours. And many of you will become hopelessly bored, as I certainly shall be as well. Since I was allowed considerable latitude in choosing the topic of my remarks, I have deemed them the United States and Poland in World War II, or perhaps more. And I would begin this way. Please bear with me. President Roosevelt endorsed the expansion of Russia's borders, and I'm about to tip over the... This is your fault.
It's very sturdy.
It's very sturdy. President Roosevelt endorsed the expansion of Russia's borders to engorge virtually all of historic Poland. Poland's neighbors would also be given over to Russian domination. No efforts were made to ensure that the regime imposed upon Poland would be acceptable to the population involved. The historic minorities would be assigned to Russia without ascertaining whether that be their will. The Russian government, which would acquire this territory, was praised, and its past outrages were erased. The president simultaneously asked other countries to endorse and support Russian expansion. He promised the Russians lavish material aid to facilitate this process. He discussed the Russian past with adulation and expressed his confidence in the political order prevailing in Moscow. The very possibility of a Russian threat to Polish security was dismissed without consideration. Whereas he endorsed Polish independence, his actions really undermined it. Poland would somehow be protected by an international body of United Nations, but the function of this body and its ability to discharge its tasks were, at best, most unclear. Beyond this, no efforts were envisioned, let alone undertaken, to protect the sovereignty of Poland or its neighbors. Poland would be strictly ethnographic, but such guidelines were not applied to other countries, for example, Russia, or, for example, Great Britain. In addition, the frontiers were established on the basis of unreliable sources. Historically, Polish territories containing no Russian minority whatsoever would nonetheless be given to Russia. When the war ended, he abandoned all interest in Poland and essentially ignored the geopolitical ruination of the country. However, he repeatedly praised the civilizational model of his own country. But I have misled and lied to you. The summary I've just given you was not the actions of Franklin D. Roosevelt. They were the actions of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is, need we be reminded, often extolled as the architect of Polish independence. Both Wilson and later Roosevelt painted uplifting and idealistic images of the new world for Poland. Wilson in his 14 points and Roosevelt in the Atlantic Charter, for example. But both abandoned any loyalty to these principles when Polish interests were really at stake. Indeed, both presidents consciously misled the Poles by suggesting falsities. Wilson endorsed Polish access to the sea, but privately opposed Polish acquisition of Danzig, Gdańsk. But he would not admit that he had done so. And really, he had no idea at all how Poland would gain access to the sea. Roosevelt, having already accepted Polish territorial transfer to Russia, tried to convince a Poloni audience that he supported or at least recognized Polish territory which he had already assigned to Russia. This is no coincidence, but rather continuity, I would argue, in American foreign policy. But what would link this Polish policy constructed almost a generation apart? How do we explain this rather unpleasant problem? Wilson was an impractical idealist, essentially ignorant of Europe. When presented with essentially Polish studies of the Polish situation, he did not even open the documents. So was Roosevelt. He refused to read State Department briefings on Poland before discussing Poland with Joseph Stalin. Both had astonishingly positive views of the Russians. Was this the geopolitics of cynicism? Praise Russia because it is useful? I should like to think this, but I fear we are dealing as much with delusion as with practical calculation. Now, an awkward problem. In both cases, these actions, profoundly damaging to Polish interests, were constructed in close collaboration with Great Britain, whose leaders repeatedly made disparaging remarks about Poland. Lloyd George during the First World War, and later Churchill of England, Wilson and Roosevelt, Wilson and later Roosevelt as well. Need we mention, for example, the British refusal to allow Poles to be part of the 1946 Victory March in London. I've lost track of what I'm going to say, so I've decided to sit down. No, I won't do that. No. These were not isolated figures, but models of American, indeed Anglo-Saxon attitude towards Poland. Poland, like all of Eastern Europe, was, and alas, I think still is, a vague reference to both Americans and British. Pilsudski once said that the inclination to assign high principles to geostrategy was American palavering. Although I hate to disagree with anything Pilsudski ever said about anything, here he is perhaps naive, or at least being sarcastic. The pattern becomes more disturbing when we consider that Herbert Hoover, not a Democrat but a Republican, who is repeatedly celebrated for the relief efforts he organized for suffering Poles in 1919, Hoover, however, had less helpful activities regarding Poland, but are rarely, if ever, noted. In 1919, Hoover met with prominent German industrialists to investigate the possibility that Germany, and not Poland, would gain the lion's share of Upper Silesia. These discussions, potentially very damaging to the Polish economy, were subterranean and little known. Hoover, even ever the businessman, simply regarded German control of this territory as more efficient than Polish. It was practicality, not prejudice, which guided him. The consequences for Poland did not concern him. This, of course, causes us to recall Lloyd George's observation that giving Upper Silesia to Poles would be like giving an alarm clock to a monkey. Once president, Hoover's administration was famous for its support of radical revision of the Versailles Treaty to Germany's benefit in both Gdańsk and even Upper Silesia, thereby damaging Poland's international position. Hoover's State Department virtually condemned Poland for treating Germany badly. Washington also denounced what they deemed an unjust reparations burden being placed upon the Germans. In 1931, Senator Bora, a prominent political figure, publicly denounced the Versailles Order and demanded radical revision to the benefit of Germany. His remarks were not idiosyncratic outrage, but had been discussed with Hoover before he made these remarks, and we may say almost certainly they represented Hoover's position, which had been decided beforehand. The Polish diplomat, Hippolyt Gliwice, sadly concluded regarding the years separating Wilson and Hoover that Poland meant absolutely nothing to the United States. Public opinion reflected this. In 1920, the American press described Polish efforts to stop Soviet Russia's invasion of Europe as, quote, Polish imperialism, an opinion openly shared by President Wilson. The idea that Poland served larger ends by preventing communist expansion was never so much as raised by the Wilson administration. Polish efforts to purchase vital supplies during the war did not receive any support from the federal government because of pricing issues concerning cloth purchases in the Carolinas. Poland's 1920 victory before Warsaw gained little attention. Within a short time, the press championed German claims for revision. Jan Smulski, the then leader of American Polonia, fell into despair and concluded that the American public support for Poland was for all practical purposes non-existent, an early demonstration of the insignificance of Poles in American politics. American financial support and investment, which the Poles had anticipated with great optimism, turned out to be very, very little. However, American funds flowing into a rebuilding Germany were very considerable. The consequences of this, I think, are obvious. In fine, during World War I, the Americans gave vague benediction to Polish independence, but subordinated that to a geostrategy favoring Russia. Washington was not capable nor morally bound to protect Poland, but this was not neglect, it was harm. In the interwar period, the Americans ignored Poland but endorsed German revisionist claims, which of course made a threat to Poland. And of course, in World War II, the American government bizarrely combined the singing of Onward Christian Soldiers at the proclamation of the Atlantic Charter, which defended national rights but soon ignored any such pledges to support Soviet demands in all of Eastern Europe, including Poland. Last time I looked, singing Onward Christian Soldiers with Joseph Stalin seems a bit odd. Efforts to explain the actions of the Roosevelt administration regarding Poland frame the question in a way which offers no clear explanation. Was the Roosevelt administration alive with supporters of Moscow, admirers of Stalin, and apologists for communists? Yes, of course it was. But arguing that Harry Hopkins or Harry Dexter White was a Soviet agent or that Joseph Davies was a ridiculous adulator of Stalin are really not important. Depictions of Roosevelt's rather blithe disregard for Eastern Europe, coupled with virtual affection for Stalin, tell us much more about the president's actions, but do not form the basis of a larger explanation. They are little more than FDR's coquettish amour-propre. Perhaps the best effort is what we might call the cynical practicality theory of geostrategy, which essentially argues that the Americans could not protect the interests of Poland because doing so would inevitably lead to a confrontation with Russia, a veritable Third World War. Such a confrontation would not have had American public support. It would not reflect the geostrategic interest of the United States. The, gosh, we're sorry, but we are already helpless. What a misfortune for you explanation. Of course, not taking action in support of Poland is one thing, but promising support and not supplying it is quite another thing. Failing to admit what you had done is yet more distasteful. But is this attractively practical theory really convincing? Did the Americans sadly have to surrender lofty principles to the demands of reality? I think the answer is probably yes, because the government's first obligation is to protect the national interest of its country. Perhaps we should reconsider from the point of view of practicality. The consequences of abandoning moral grandeur for gritty practicality. Was the Atlantic Charter revoked or merely ignored? In fine, do you announce lofty guidelines, ignore them, and never admit that you had done so in the first place? This is best captured in an episode I think we all know well. The Polish government in exile, as early as 1940, repeatedly alerted the American government to the fact that the Germans were behaving barbarically in Poland and slaughtering the Jewish population. We all know that there was no American response whatsoever. We should not denounce the Americans for their inaction regarding bombing of the death camps, for example. The argument that it was not militarily feasible is persuasive, I think, although the other oft-cited argument that it would have distracted the vector of the war is, I think, rather tasteless. But the central episode is the 1943 meeting between Roosevelt and the heroic Jan Karski in the White House. After Karski's lengthy report of Polish and Jewish suffering, Roosevelt said absolutely nothing, save a bizarre question about horses. Where does one begin in analyzing that? Years later, when Karski and I had dinner together, I asked him about this episode, and he was still utterly aghast by Roosevelt's behavior. Let us combine the series of chronological questions. In other words, do we have decisions made on the geostrategic demands of practicality, or is there something larger and perhaps less obvious? Would the construction of an ethnographic Poland, Wilson's ideal, or ignoring Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Lithuanians' demand for independence, but magically ignoring an ethnographic analysis regarding Russia, and thus creating a quasi-Tsarist empire, really be a good idea, or even a practical one at that? Would a vast Russia with no significant restraints in the West and already visible desires in the Far East really be in American interest? In Europe, a small Poland would be helpless. Thus, who would be the only barrier to Russian hegemony in Europe? Germany, or in other words, World War II. The failure of the Western powers to congeal what my former friend Huey, not that he ceased being friends, he died. My friend Huey Kostanek called the shadow zone of Eastern Europe, the complex territory separating Russia from Germany, does not deserve blame. It was beyond their capacity. However, it seems never to have occurred to them that this was the key to European security in general. This is not practicality, but geostrategic short-sightedness on the part of the Americans and the British, which profits only aggressiveness. They have somehow failed to see that the Second World War was less the inevitable class of repulsive ideologies, but the failure to make efforts to construct a sounder European architecture, best captured by Pilsudski's famous doomed to greatness argument concerning Poland. Excuses for this American policy rest on an isolationist position. The United States did not wish to become deeply involved in European politics. This is a reasonable summary of American predilections, but does not explain why we would champion making the situation worse. Next, how would American support for the revision of the Versailles Treaty following World War I be in European or ultimately in American interests? Would a Germany, unburdened by the treaty's restraints, be an attractive member of the European community? Who would restrain its functions, its fascination with Weltmacht musings? America would commit nothing to European security. Its policy regarding the League is here eloquent. Great Britain was understandably obsessed with its empire as the last foundation of imperial greatness. France was too small, too weak, and simply too depressed to lead Europe. Who would then constrain Germany? Support for German revision aided Berlin and weakened Poland. Eventually and inevitably, only Russia is a potential restraint. We have given ourselves, once again, the Second World War by the obliviousness to European architecture. This leaves us with the final and most vexing dilemma, which reflects American geopolitical practice: how to deal with the Soviets in the Second World War. Here the Americans finally demonstrate insight previously not abundant from them. It practiced highly leveraged diplomacy, regarding Europe as essentially dispensable. Protect only British interests, the rest of Europe was an inconsequentiality. Delay serious involvement in Europe as long as possible, hire the Russians as mercenaries, paying them with limitless materiel, and then settle the deal by approving their seizure of Poland, among other things. Then claim not to be just a victor, a humble achievement to be sure, but to be the moral champion of the world. After all, did not Dwight Eisenhower refer to American military efforts as, and I'm quoting, the crusade in Europe? I should remind you that crusades are not wars, they are the reification of a divine mission. After all, the war was not a geostrategic struggle, one of the countless in history, but a moral combat between good and evil. The fact that one of the good was responsible for millions of deaths in the Holodomor alone, mass imprisonments, countless executions, and uncountable, often awkward acts of unpleasantness is simply distracting. In fine, Poland is simply a preposterously insignificant counterpose to the mission of God. But here we may move beyond Europe to consider the wisdom of urging Russia to go to war with Japan in 1943 at Tehran, or musing about a four-policeman vision which reduces Europe to utter insignificance. Again, is this another victory of practicality over moral pronouncement, or is it a geopolitical short-sightedness? Retrospectively, we must repair to Tomasz Mazuryk's bitter observation that large powers treat smaller ones as is convenient for them at the moment. Finally, we must place the last century's Polish aspects into historic context. Poland has had a very difficult time since the mid-17th century. Whether we accept the Krakow School's argument that the failure of internal politics led the country to ruin, suicide by politics, or if we place more emphasis on geopolitical evolution, the aggressive disposition of neighbors, the results have been the same thing. World War II was an episode, but the most bitter episode in modern Polish history. The West, including the United States, did little to assuage this, and with little concern may well have made the situation worse. Yes, Poland was the first to fight, but it introduces a far more telling truth. The United States had never been the best friend of Poland, unless we understand friendship as meaningless bromides. Poland had been disappearing in the late 18th century as the United States was forming. It was an anachronism to Washington from the very beginning. Thereafter, Poland never figured in the geostrategic vision of the Americans and was not part of the Anglo-Saxon cultural world. World War II behavior was the inevitable consequence of this. Helping Poland, or at least wringing your hands in remorse, was not to be expected. For Poland, Roosevelt was a geopolitical and cultural descendant of the so-called Founding Fathers. Washington never cared that Poland was the first to fight, nor will it ever. It doesn't matter. In the realm of simple morality, Poland owes the Americans nothing. But it is the Poles' moral obligation, it is our moral obligation to remind them that they do. As a scholar noted a decade ago, during the war, political decisions were made in Washington, in London, and in Moscow, but the moral capital of the world was Warsaw. Thank you very much.
Thank you.